Wednesday, November 9th, 2022. James drove down his old street. He passed Hank's home and saw a for sale sign posted. Neither of the men spoke much about that night, as neither knew what to say. James knew his co-workers wouldn't have believed him that a ghostly woman kidnapped the boy and dislocated his left elbow. And the story Hank told was that the two men chased away a strange person after a scuffle in the house. James scratched his left arm, which sat snugly in a sling, and itched the bandage that wrapped around his head. It had been years since he visited his old home. He arrived and parked in the driveway. The house had been abandoned after James's family dissolved, and the bank who foreclosed it never sold it, and less than a year later went out of business. And so, it sat empty, collecting dirt and grime. Some of James's family's belongings were still tarped in the garage, a few pieces of furniture and some personal items like old clothes. James had been having trouble sleeping. His mind wrestled with the paranormal terror he had experienced. Sarah's ghostly figure was burned into his thoughts. There was something he felt as though he could remember, but the thought struggled to form itself. He hoped, in some way, his old home might jolt the memory from the fog of his mind. He stepped out of his patrol car, being careful to not bump his elbow. He wandered up the short driveway and opened the unlocked garage door. Dust and cobwebs covered every inch. He went to the back corner where there was a collection of boxes. He pulled the tarp away and opened the first one. It was Christmas lights and decorations. He put the box aside and looked in the second. Photo albums. He grabbed the top one. It was his grandfather's. He opened the page and looked at the old and yellowed photos. Most were black and white. He saw his young grandfather standing in an open field, and next to him he saw Robert Morgan. There were 4 other men that he did not recognize. He pulled the picture out from the album and flipped it over. Written in ink, it said Bear Creek 1926. This must have been before they started the gold mine. Seeing Robert made his stomach churn, and he felt an uncomfortable shiver. He slid the photo back into the album and saw another. This time it was his grandfather posing with a few other workers near a big pile of dirt. Robert was in this one too, but he was in the background pointing, as if giving orders to people outside of the picture. James's eye caught something. He pulled it closer to his face but found it difficult to see still. He looked around and found an old magnifying glass. He used it on the photo. It was the same symbol he saw in the vision from the mansion. A strange circle with multiple hollow triangles and a singular dot in the center. The symbol wasn't a family crest or the logo of Robert's business, and he had never seen it before. He slid the photo into the top pocket of his vest. He continued to flick through the album's pages. He found another picture from later in time. His grandfather looked to be in his 50s now, and Robert looked practically the same as from the earlier pictures. They were at the Moose Lodge, a communal men's club which had existed a little after Wellsprings was founded. Maybe the symbol belonged to them. James got in his department SUV and drove back to town, making his way to the Moose Lodge, which still existed in the heart of Wellsprings. It had already started to get late, as the telltale nightly haze started to appear. He pulled into the parking lot of the lodge. It was closed, only open on Fridays and Saturdays. James crept to the back door and fiddled with the knob. He already knew this door had a problem locking, as the current landlord had called the sheriff after teens had broken in and held a party. He entered into the main hall. Long dark wood tables and black couches filled up most of the space. Paintings, mostly of rivers and mountains, hung on different walls. The light was getting dim outside, so he shut the curtains of the exterior windows and pulled his small flashlight out. He searched along the couches and then the main bar. It held quite the collection of expensive alcohols. He looked around and saw nothing of real note. He went to the stairs that led up to the office floor. The wood stairs creaked with each step as he ascended. The office door was locked. James took his pocket knife out and slid it between the door and the frame. He managed to get the blade behind the bolt and with finesse slowly moved it out of the door frame. Inside now, the office appeared normal. Tan walls, a few computers, desks, and file cabinets. The only oddity was a large bookcase that seemed out of place for the decor upstairs. He looked around it. The books were pretty typical. Dictionaries, some fiction and nonfiction. He looked around the back of the bookcase. Something was behind it. He pushed it out of the way and another office door greeted him. He opened the door and stepped inside. This office was lavish. Everything had a don't touch feeling. He saw a partially smoked cigar sitting in an ashtray on the desk in the back. There were tons of bookcases, all with old-looking books. Some had no labels that he could see. He went along the desk and sat in the chair. He pulled open the drawers of the desk and looked around. Something stabbed the tip of his finger as he withdrew back. "Fuck," he whispered. He moved a folder and saw a blade. He pulled it out, a bright silver dagger with a dark leather hilt. He examined the blade and saw it had a symbol engraved. He brushed his light along it, trying to get a better angle to see the symbol. It looked an awful lot like the symbol Robert Morgan had been wearing. The only real difference was instead of an outer circle, it had a snake eating itself. He found a small journal next to the dagger and opened it. There were symbols and illustrations, and the few words on the pages seemed nonsensical. One page had what looked like an angel crying as the sun rose, and written above it in a different ink it said, 1926, Awakened. The next page had the appearance of a small old town with people crying on their knees as a vile man waved to the mountains. The next after that had what looked like mothers crying over the bodies of their children. Each page flipped, the drawings grew progressively more horrifying. One picture in particular caught his attention. It was people in chains being pulled into a large stone building. Two men with whips walked next to them, keeping their pace. And at the front of the stone building, the doorway led to complete darkness. Beside the door, however, a figure made of the same darkness stood and watched. James did not know exactly how the pieces fit together, but he knew some evil was at play here. He heard a creak behind him. He turned and saw a man leaned up against the doorframe. James, not missing a beat, spoke first. "Oh, hey, I got a call about some teens messing around and came to check it out. The back door was open, so I've been wandering around looking to see if they broke in again." The man did not reply at first, and leaned off the doorframe and then took a step forward as James shined his light on him. It was Richard Prady, the current head and owner of the Moose's Lodge. Richard waved and took a step. "Howdy, Deputy. I haven't seen any teens around, but I'm glad you were here to make sure we didn't have them throwing another party. Don't get me wrong, I was a kid too, I can't blame them. But that doesn't mean I want them screwing around in here either," Richard said with what appeared to be an insincere tone. "I'll be on my way then," James responded. Richard didn't move. He just stood in front of the door. James's gut yelled at him. His instincts told him this was no friendly encounter. James paused for a second and observed Richard. James spoke again. "Unless there's anything else you needed?" he asked. "Well, Deputy, I couldn't help but notice you were looking around, perhaps not just for some kids," Richard said as his voice grew slightly deeper. Another man stepped into the room as he squeezed past Richard. James knew this was trouble. He slid the light over the second man, but he did not know him. James shifted the flashlight into his left hand, still slung to his chest. His right hand drifted near the right side of his belt by his pistol. Richard barked at him. "I don't think you understand, Deputy. You're meddling with things that are well above your pay grade." The other man took a step towards James as James unbuckled his pistol. Everyone froze. James knew there was only one way he was leaving this room. The second man charged as James drew his pistol and fired 4 shots dead center as the man tripped and crashed into the desk, snapping it in the center. The man collapsed to the floor along with the desk. Richard rushed to James, hitting his right arm away and smashed into his left, sending a wave of incredible pain through James. James accidentally fired into the ceiling as the two men fought. James kicked Richard's shin and headbutted him. Richard stumbled back. As he looked up, he saw the barrel of the service pistol. "Listen, motherfucker, you take one more step and you're a fucking body bag," James said with renewed confidence. Richard spat blood from his lips onto the floor and growled at him. "Like I said, you don't know what the hell you've just brought down upon yourself," Richard shouted as he charged again, and James fired straight into the man's forehead, sending his limp body rolling to his feet. James quickly fled out to his car as he saw other strange men running to the building. His windows burst as bullets struck it. He started the engine, tucked himself under the dashboard, and put it in reverse, using the backup camera to navigate out of the parking lot. A hail of gunfire struck the vehicle. A few shots narrowly missed James. James radioed for backup, but no one responded. He spun the car around and into drive, blasting down the road. An old sedan passed him, but quickly veered and made a U-turn to pursue him. "You've got to be kidding me," James shouted in frustration. The sedan accelerated as James did too, the two cars weaving through the road. The road became more winding as they reached the outer skirts of town. These roads led out to the old highway and up to the few remaining mountain roads. A shotgun blast echoed out from behind him as his back window cracked, glass splattering into his trunk. He knew he needed to take decisive action. James slammed his brakes and spun his car around, putting the driver's door on the far side away from the speeding sedan. The sedan slammed its brakes and 4 men exited out and took cover. James had to move quick. He put a fresh magazine into his pistol as he backed away, ensuring he remained hidden from the men. They fired a few shots into the SUV. James crouched lower and rushed into the dark woods. He was unsure if the men had seen him move, but they were fixated on his SUV. James slowly crept along the edge of the trees, closer to the men. He ambushed them at less than 20 feet away. The closest man had the shotgun, and his body crumpled as one of James's shots hit his spine. The other 3 men, startled, ducked and tried to scram away to cover. He shot the second man in the hip. He tumbled to the pavement and James shot him in the side of the head. The 3rd man made it to the woods across, and the 4th hid by the trunk of the sedan, shooting in James's general direction. James reloaded again. His heart felt like it was ready to explode from his chest. He took a deep breath and relocated. "Come on out, officer," one of the men mockingly called. James slowed his thoughts and zeroed in on the men's sound. He waited, shrouded by the thicket he was now behind. He heard a twig snap. His pistol had a small flashlight underneath it. Normally, he could activate it with his left hand, but given its current condition, he had to slide his shooting finger off the trigger and activate it with his right thumb. The light came on and illuminated the man. James reset his hand and fired into the man's center. Wounded but still alive, still a threat, the man dove behind a tree. He hollered in pain. A shot rang out from the other man shooting at the light, grazing James's right shoulder. He ducked behind cover and turned his flashlight off as another shot impacted the tree in front of him. James rushed to a different position and listened. "This is very inconsiderate of you, James," the man spoke, though James did not recognize the voice. The strange man continued. "You've forced our hand. We needed more time, but c'est la vie. It's a shame, really, that I have to put a bullet in your skull. You would have witnessed a great thing tonight. A reckoning. A new—" The man's words were cut short as James fired a shot through the man's mouth. He fell backwards, firing his pistol as he did. James approached, using cover, as he heard the man gurgling. James found him crawled up against the sedan, leaned into the back side of it. He kicked the pistol out of the man's hand and turned his light back on. He had no idea who this man was, nor his business in Wellsprings. "Who the fuck are you?" James said in anger. The man gurgled, not likely to be of much use. The man seemed to laugh as blood ran from the sides of his mouth. The man turned and looked directly into James's eyes. He saw a glint of red for a brief millisecond. James fired into the man's head, finishing him. James looked around the wood line with his flashlight, searching for the third man he had shot in the chest. He did not see or hear anything. Perhaps, James thought, he bled out in the woods. James unslung his arm. It hurt bad. He went to the back of his SUV and pulled his service rifle, an AR-15 with custom furniture. He checked it was loaded, stuffed a few magazines into his vest, and got back into the driver's seat. He turned it on and started to make his way back into town. A few miles before he hit the exterior of town, he killed all the lights on his car and just slowly drifted along the road, trying to stay in the shadows of the trees. The moon was strong this night. He stopped and put the car in park. He saw hooded men with torches walking through the streets. They were herding townsfolk who struggled against them together. They held up guns to keep them in line. He saw Maggie was near one of the gunmen. He struck her with the butt of his rifle as she turned to plead to him. They all started to walk down the road, down towards the Morgan estate. James dismounted his SUV and shadowed them through the woods. He saw another deputy break free, hitting a gunman in an attempt to disarm him, but he was cut down by a few shots from another hooded man. The crowd screamed as a voice yelled for them to calm down. James wanted to just open fire right there and then, but he knew this was too dangerous. He might tag a few of the hooded men, but the chaos would certainly get some of the townsfolk killed. Standing torches lit up the Morgan Mansion's driveway as the front doors were open, leading to darkness. Hooded men stood along the path and up near the door. He saw the mysterious figure, the smoke-like man. Another man exited the mansion and removed his hood. James couldn't really see him well, but he would have sworn it was Robert Morgan himself. "Get them inside," the man shouted. That voice. It was Robert Morgan. The same voice he heard in the vision in the mansion. It couldn't be. Robert had died years ago, and even if he hadn't, that'd make him near 130 years old. But this man looked no more than 60. It struck James, a sense of déjà vu. The scene reminded him of the illustration from the journal. James raised his rifle and aimed at Morgan. He knew no matter what, these people were in peril, and he had to act. He fired. Morgan dropped. The crowd screamed again, and the hooded men rushed down towards the road. The innocent townfolks rushed away as the hooded men lost total control. James kept firing. 2 down, 3, and now 4. Fire started to hit nearby James. He repositioned and continued to mow down the hooded men. A man rushed him with a knife. James hit the man's head with a stabbing motion by the barrel of his rifle and fired point blank into the man's chest several times. He looked back from cover, and from what he could tell, most of the hooded men were down. A few, still clinging to life, crawled away. He left the woods and made his way towards the mansion. A wounded man by the road tried to grab his pistol. James dispatched him. James looked along the porch of the mansion, but Morgan was gone, along with the strange shadow figure. The fog had suddenly rolled in, which made it difficult to see further than 20 feet in any direction. James reached the porch and saw black blood where Morgan had fallen. He turned the light attached to his rifle on and entered the mansion. He scanned with his rifle raised as he slowly stepped into the main chamber. The wind outside howled as the old building creaked. He heard a step and looked up. Robert stood atop the stairs at the second level. James ordered him down, but Robert just stood there. Robert took 1 step down. His skin was gray. His eyes glinted with red. "You have no concept of the forces at play here," Robert said as he took another step down. "You are witness to the birth of a new age." The dark figure emerged at the top of the second floor, standing beside the railing. "Humanity has fought for generations under the name of false gods," Robert spoke. He gestured to the figure before continuing. "But now witness true divinity, true power, our benefactor." Robert took another step down and James fired into his chest. Robert flinched. "He is displeased at our slow progress, but now he is nearly risen." Robert's voice echoed through the mansion. "Don't take another step," James barked at him. Robert did, and James fired again. "You resist the inevitable." Robert seemed to smirk as he descended another step. James slowly lurched back as he tried to maintain space. Robert reached the bottom of the stairs, and as he did, the mansion transformed into its old state. Robert charged at James. James fired but was immediately grappled by Robert. The two men struggled to the ground as James kicked himself away from Robert and scrambled to his feet. Robert was right back on him, and James was smashed into a wall on the right side of the room. Robert threw James across to the floor near the stairs. James rolled and drew his sidearm, dumping his magazine into Robert's chest and head. Robert stumbled back, but the wounds did nothing more than impede him. Robert pulled James up by his neck and blasted him against the side of the stairwell. Black blood poured from the 3 holes in Robert's face. The mansion shifted back to its decayed form as Robert choked James. He crushed him into the side of the wall of the stairwell as the wood of the wall buckled and James went through. James fell down in the darkness and landed awkwardly. Stunned, he collected himself and looked up. He saw a flicker of candlelight. James figured he fell into some kind of basement, but as he approached the light, he saw old stonework. He entered a small room. It looked like a crypt. In the center was an old table, covered with burning candles. Next to them stood a tall stack of papers and ancient books. James only glanced for a moment, but it seemed like more occult imagery. He saw a corridor leading further and went into it. The whole place looked like ruins. He wondered if this is why Robert built the mansion here. It was dry and cold. He saw light ahead. He entered another chamber, this one much bigger than the first room. Hanging from a metal chain was his dispatcher. She looked to have been bled out like an animal. Under her, a metal pot full of blood. A breeze blew past James as he turned to look towards the middle of the chamber. The dark figure appeared, the once flowing and smoke-like shape now more defined. Its eyes red like molten metal. The creature seemed to irradiate heat. It glided across towards James. The warmth grew with every inch it closed. James pulled out his baton and readied himself. The figure halted just beyond reach. A pulsing red energy seemed to glimmer around it. It roared and James was blown back off his feet. James started to float above the ground as the entity lifted him with invisible forces. James's arms and legs bound, unable to move. Robert entered the chamber. He was carrying a long silver dagger. Robert walked to James, who helplessly was frozen in the air. Robert raised the dagger and went to thrust as Sarah manifested in the chamber and screamed. Robert missed, and the disruption partially freed James, who kicked Robert's arm away. The dagger flew out and hit the dark figure. A large red scratch appeared as it flew past and landed away. The beast roared again as James fell to the ground. The figure's wound bled flame which dripped like liquid onto the stone. Robert charged at James. James leapt out of the way and ran towards the dagger. Robert in a frenzy pursued. James grabbed the blade as Robert reached him. They crashed to the ground and rolled over and over, struggling. James jabbed the blade under Robert's chin and up through and into the roof of his mouth. Robert fell back and James ripped the blade from him and stabbed him in his chest 4 times. Robert's body quivered and went still. The dark figure grabbed James from behind and lifted him up as James stabbed into its neck. Fire poured from the wound, burning James's hand and forearm. The figure disappeared as James fell down yet again. Everything went quiet. He stood and saw Robert's body started to dissolve into putrid black water. As more of the liquid started to flow out of the cracks and crevices of the stone chamber near the ceiling, the enraged entity reemerged and rushed at James. It tore at James's flesh with long black claws, shredding chunks of cloth and skin from him. James screamed in pain as the creature's unrelentless assault pushed him back into the wall. The black water pouring down rained on him. The water impacted into the demon, sizzling as the creature seemed to be hindered by it. Everything went black. It seemed as though James had been plunged into deep water. He held his breath, but he could not see anything but a strange glow above him. Ahead of him, he saw the demon, its wounds still bleeding fire into the dark water. It convulsed like it was in agony. The woman in white appeared and grabbed the figure and pulled it down and past James's ability to see. James swam up towards the strange glow. He surfaced and was astonished. It was moonlight, and he was no longer in the mansion, but somewhere in the woods, in a river. Across the bank, he saw Sarah. He swam over to her. He got out of the cold water and trembled. Sarah turned and faced him. Her face was gripped with sadness. "Sarah?" James whimpered. Sarah just looked in James's eyes. She reached out to him. He went to grab her hand but went through it instead. Tears fell from his eyes. Sarah's gaze drifted back down as she turned to the river. James collapsed. His wounds continued to bleed. He took a deep breath and looked at the moon. Sarah now stood over him, watching him. He saw pain in her face. James awoke and stood. He turned and saw Sarah again. "James," she said while crying. James called out, crying with relief. Sarah grabbed his hand and squeezed. "I'm sorry," Sarah spoke with shivered words. James looked down and saw his body.